This is the session presented by the Core Practice Consortium, and we want to be sure to thank Barbara Schneider and Mark Behrens for giving us this gift of a presidential session to describe this work. There will be a number of us talking today, and we look forward to sharing this work with you. I'm Pam Grossman, and one of the co-directors of the consortium, and our presenters are up on stage. The title of this session is Enriching Research and Innovation Through the Specification of Professional Practice. Quite a mouthful. But what we'll be talking about today is collective work by the Core Practice Consortium. And so we're representing this larger group today. There's Megan Franke, Deborah Ball, Sarah Kavanaugh, Mark Winchittle, Jessica Thompson, and our discussant Tony Breich. But we're also joined by other members of the consortium that are here, and I want to make sure that they're recognized as well. So if the other members of the consortium are here, if you could stand up. Great, thank you. The Core Practice Consortium includes faculty from a variety of different institutions that include the ones that are up on this screen. And they cross both more traditional university-based teacher preparation programs, and also, as you notice, we have the Boston Teacher Residency. In addition, some of these universities run alternative routes themselves. So at the University of Washington, the UACT program is part of this consortium as well. So we're really quite a diverse set of programs for preparing teachers, and that is actually part of what this project is all about. So let me start with the problems that we're trying to address through this work. The first is one that the field has been talking about for a long time, and that's the lack of common language for describing teaching. The difficulty of having a precise language for describing both the work of teaching and the work of teacher education. And that's one of the challenges that this group has taken up. A second is the curricular sprawl of teacher education, which I've captured with that notion of so much to learn, so little time. We keep adding things to the teacher education curriculum, and as a result, it's hard to figure out what's the focus. Where do we really sort of put our work and intention in all of the things that we could teach novice teachers, knowing we have so relatively little time to prepare them? A third problem we're trying to address is moving from teaching teachers about teaching to teaching them how to enact teaching. So moving, as we call this, the problem of enactment, moving again from both what to how. And we'll talk a lot about that particular issue today. And finally, we're trying to establish common ground for teacher educators to learn from one another. Again, we work in so many different programs, so many different kinds of programs. Within every institution, there are multiple programs. So how do we find common ground to begin to develop professional consensus over the work of teacher education? So that is really at the core of what the Core Practice Consortium is trying to do. This is part of a much broader agenda for both research and development around teacher education. And you'll see that we've put our consortium right there in the middle. This is much more than about core practices, defining core practices, and more than about defining the pedagogies of teacher education. We see ourselves working within this broader system to try to think of how we can develop, again, more coherence around the preparation of teachers that looks at both principled visions for teaching and how we define those, thinking about the curriculum of teacher education is organized around practice. So it's a different version, again, of practice-based teacher education. Thinking very much about the pedagogies of teacher education and how we teach teachers. And finally, again, all of this feeding into the novice teacher learning. We don't think this is the only way to approach the problems that I have articulated, but we see it as one way, again, of making progress as a field. One of the things that we've tried to do as a consortium is to learn from prior efforts to reform teacher education. So at some of our sessions, we actually have had people come and talk to us about different networks that have tried to reform teacher education, from the Holmes Group to Good Lads Network, and trying to learn both what worked and what didn't work. Our kind of theory of action is, again, trying to organize ourselves around the specification of these core practices and the pedagogies of teacher ed, developing tools and resources around those as a means to improve the quality of teaching and ultimately, obviously, student learning. So let me talk a little bit about this notion of core practices and why we decided to focus on this. So a number of us began thinking about this notion of core practices as practices that are central to the daily work of teaching, practices that all teachers have to enact at some point when they enter the classroom. These practices we see as central to supporting student learning. That's why we care about them. But they're also central to supporting teacher learning. They're fundamental for developing more complex forms of practice. And these practices underlie a number of different curricular approaches. They're not tagged to any particular one. So we all, many of us in the group, all were playing with this idea of core practices and what that meant for teacher education. But almost immediately, we began to notice that we actually described these things differently. So we had core practices, high leverage practices, core high leverage practices. So even within ourselves, we were not using the same language to describe these things. When we began to talk about the pedagogies of teacher education, we noticed a similar thing happening. I talk about approximations, Megan talks about rehearsals, Mark talks about micro-teaching, try-out simulations. So we began to think about, could we discipline ourselves as a field to use common language for describing what, in fact, might be common about what we're trying to do. So the very first meeting of this group was trying to work on this problem of common language. And the first thing we tackled, you could see is meeting number 2 in November 2013, was to try to develop a common definition of what we meant by core practice. This turned out to be challenging, even though I think we have a lot of commonality of really trying to figure out, what do we mean by this? How do we define it? How can we define it in terms that we could all subscribe to and use in our own work? We began then to start doing the same kind of work around core teaching practices, sort of this notion of both the general practices, such as orchestrating whole class discussion that we'll be talking a lot about today, or modeling, as well as subject-specific practices that might include in science identifying inquiry-worthy ideas in science, or modeling historical thinking skills, those practices that are specific to a particular subject matter. And again, part of what the group has tried to do is to try to see if we can develop some common understandings and language around these practices. It's probably important for us also to talk a little bit about what we don't mean by core practices, because I think often when people hear this, they begin to think back to some earlier work in the field, such as competency-based teacher education. When we talk about core practices, we do not mean teaching competencies or a checklist of competencies, nor do we mean techniques divorced from theory or from practice. So it's worth taking a minute to look at how we define practice, because this definition animates the rest of the work that you'll hear about. So we think of practice in complex domains as involving the orchestration of understanding, skill, relationship, and identity to accomplish particular activities with others in specific environments. when you think of this definition, you think about this notion of entering a practice. So when we talk about entering a law practice or entering a medical practice, you're entering a professional practice that has certain consequences for your professional identity, for the kinds of work that you'll be doing within that setting, and some professional agreement about the standards of quality within that field. So we think about this very much as the notion of entering practice. As I mentioned, we've been working to specify practice, so here's a definition that the group agreed on around classroom discussion. And in this particular definition, we agreed across subject matters to use this particular definition. So again, part of the work of the group is to really kind of struggle with this notion of, are we talking about the same thing? Are we using the same language to describe the same underlying phenomenon? This has led to some moments where we think we're describing the same thing, but it turns out we're not. So Megan told us at one meeting, I don't model in teacher education. And I said, well, do you make your thinking visible to the students? Do you try to sort of do model lessons where you do the kinds of things you hope they'll do? She goes, oh yeah, I do that. And I said, well, I actually call that modeling. So that's the kind of work that we're doing, of trying to say, okay, can we agree that if these are the things we're doing, can we agree on these definitions? We've also tried to identify common pedagogies of teacher education and to specify these, again, in some detail so that as a field we can agree to more or less enact these pedagogies in similar ways. So we're using the framework around teaching practice that includes the representation or opportunities to see skilled practice, which could involve use of video or use of model lessons. That's where the modeling comes in. The decomposition or unpacking of complex practice, which often happens around the use of either video or modeling, where you're unpacking the practice and making both the visible and invisible clear for novices. And also various kinds of approximations of practices, which gets to that issue of enactment. So again, part of what we're trying to specify are the nature of rehearsals in teacher education and what that means. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of this session. I'll be passing this on to Megan, who's going to talk about the role of content in this work around core practices. Some people have asked us, where's the content? And many of us are people who've worked on issues of subject matter knowledge and content for many years, so we wanted to make that very visible. We'll also talk about the issue of core practices for equity and where equity and social justice fits into this agenda. A little bit about what it means to build a community around this work. And then we'll describe the research agenda that we're just engaging in that will, again, involve the different universities and programs that are involved. So let me turn this over to Megan.
Thanks, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. So, as Pam mentioned, one of the things we probably hear more often than anything else about this core practice work and building this core practice work in the field is a very significant concern that folks have about that we're developing core practices that are separate from content. And I think we all understand where that fear comes from, that you could come up with a set of practices that people perceive to be things you could teach anybody any day, and they could walk into a classroom and be competent regardless of the content that they're teaching. And I think what we want to do today is hopefully be really clear that that isn't the way that we're talking about practice, and it's not the way in which we're trying to organize and think of what it means to work on core practices in teacher education. So I want to do that by delving into particular examples in mathematics, because that's the kind of work that I do. And I think looking at the specifics and really thinking about both the grain size at which we're thinking about core practice and the way in which we work on a system of core practices together will help people try to make sense of where content fits in what it means to work on core practices. I want to take us back first, though, to something that Pam talked about, which is how we think about what a practice is. And at one of our recent meetings, I didn't tell Matt that I was going to do this to him, but at one of our recent meetings, we all were doing some writing about how we think about the core practice work and what constitutes the work we're doing. And Matt and Elizabeth had written some quotes that I thought were pretty important for reorienting ourselves to what it means to work on practice. So Matt said the word practice may be easily connotated with simply a move or an action. And I think that's people's fear, that we're talking about a move or an action outside the context of the work we're doing. However, literature from sociology, specifically that articulated by Reckwitz, discusses social practices as common understandings that are influenced by both knowledge and skill to address a particular goal. So we're thinking about social practices, right, that are influenced by both knowledge and skill to address a particular goal. And hopefully that goal will come, you'll see that coming back throughout our talk today. And then Elizabeth said that it's surrounded by students and immersed in practice, that core practice work involves the moment that occurs in unfolding interactions with students and what those moments afford for taking up content area teaching as a living and breathing practice. So I want you to kind of walk through this work with me in thinking about practice as this interactive social space in which we're trying to help pre-service teachers or teachers in general develop a particular identities as teachers who can do particular kind of mathematical teaching. And we actually then articulate what our vision of mathematics teaching is, and we draw on the research in mathematics education to help, and outside of mathematics education, to help us think about that. So our notions of the kinds of teachers we hope to support and develop come out of the research literature and theories in the field. And you'll see here that we try and really specify what we mean by that with a set of principled ideas on which drives how we think about what we're going to work on, and that's an evolving set of principles, but really based in what our colleagues have been thinking about around what it means to teach mathematics in ways that really develop students' understanding and attend to who the students are and what they're capable of. So we start with a vision, and then we go back to the definition that Pam put up about classroom discussion. So if we take this definition and say, so we have a vision of the kind of mathematics teacher we're trying to support and develop, what would it look like to support them to become competent and good at facilitating classroom discussion in mathematics? So we took that definition and as a consortia group in mathematics tried to unpack that definition of mathematics classroom discussion. And what you'll see down the left side is we kind of parse the practice into planning and clear instructional goals, eliciting students' mathematical thinking, orienting students to each other's ideas into the mathematics, and closing the discussion, highlighting the mathematical goal. And I was going to highlight down the right side which of these things are particularly about the mathematical content, but I couldn't separate any of them out because all of them are really about the mathematical content, right? Whether you're thinking about, so if you look at interpret and make sense of students' mathematical solutions and ideas in relation to the mathematical goal of the discussion, you can clearly think of that as a mathematical work, right? To understand students' mathematical thinking and to really unpack that, you really are thinking about the content of the mathematics. But also embedded in there is really considering students' histories and their participation and status in the classroom, which isn't separate from working on the mathematics. And so all of the things that we unpack here on the right side are in essence working on the content of mathematics in relation to all other aspects. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that we're not working on these core practices in isolation. We're working on these core practices in relation to each other and within a system of what Pam talked about of these pedagogies of teacher education, so that the students in our courses are working on these core practices in a way that they're both unpacking these practices, they're observing these practices, they're participating and planning in them themselves, and they're going out into schools and working on these practices and reflecting on them. And all throughout this, right, they're working on the content of mathematics. So all of these are embedded in the teaching and learning of mathematics. I think the easiest way to help you see what we mean by that is to give you an example of what that looks like as we work on preparing our students to engage in mathematical discussion. And so we're going to drop into a rehearsal at the University of Washington where Elham Kazemi is leading the group with her teacher ed students. And they're working on instructional activity around having students choral count. So they're in the methods class. One of the students in the methods class, a pre-service teacher, is leading the activity. And the rest of the class are participating as students, and Elham, as the teacher educator, is going to intervene. But the goal of the choral counting activity they're doing is to work on some ideas of place value, and particularly understanding 10 as a unit. They're working on these aspects of discussion, eliciting and responding to students, orienting students to each other, and positioning students competently. So I'm going to let you watch what goes on as we support pre-service teachers here.
So listen. Good. Do we see any other patterns? Yes.
You're adding 4 to the tens place.
You're adding 4
On each
to the
column.
tens place. On each column. So which column are you looking at when you
So
start?
at the top of the column, column number 2, you add 4 to the tens place of the original column.
So from here,
Yeah.
okay, so there's nothing here. And you add 4 to this column. You got 4, so what about this column?
You add another 4.
You got another 4.
So you don't even have to do all that other adding. You just have to add 4 to the numbers that you have on the original column. Or
Going
column
this way?
4.
Okay, so that means in this, if we went 4, 8, what we added
So it'd be 12 in the tens column. So
12 in the tens column.
So this is the 12 in the tens column. I wonder how you have 12 in the tens column.
Yeah, how would you have 12 in the tens?
How would you do that?
you have 120 there, but but there's an additional 4 because we're beginning to count again at that point. So really, you have 2 in the tens column and 1 in the hundreds column.
So how are you feeling up there, Alzina?
Like,
As Lisa
hey,
was talking.
so I need to repeat what he said. But I'm like,
What did he say, right?
I need to be able to repeat what he said and then throw that back out to the class so they can say, oh, well, what does anyone think about that, or can anyone explain what he was saying? I
So
need to
you,
explain
right,
it.
you're
I
in
need to
the
understand
position,
myself.
yeah. You're in the position all the time of trying to make sense of this person live on the slide. At the same time that you're trying to decide, do I repeat this? Do I understand what this person is saying? Does anybody else follow what this person is saying, right?
So I'm thinking in my head, I need to ask him to explain that one more time, and hopefully he'll remember what he
What
just
he
told me.
just said.
I'll pay extra attention.
Just out of curiosity, in that case, when he said you have 12 in the 10s, would you wouldn't take time out of session to go over regrouping, flipping over to the hundreds place? I mean, how would you even address that? Or would you just kind of, it would totally kill your momentum?
So I wouldn't go off on a huge tangent right here. I'd make, you said 12 in the tens.
You have 12 tens.
You have
That's the
12
issue.
tens, right, exactly. So I'd say, that's really interesting to me. What do you think 12 tens means?
So hopefully that gave you a sense of a couple things, right? One is how central working on the mathematics is to engaging these teachers in learning to teach mathematics, but also how those aspects of discussion that we've outlined emerge as they're engaging in learning how to teach, and that we have the opportunity then to help support them to learn how to do that practice. And the other thing I hope that you see in that example is that it's about the teacher becoming a particular kind of teacher and trying to figure out for herself, how do I enact these practices in relation to who I am and what I'm doing? The other thing that I think you can see here is that we're working on really how you work with not just that student who's talking, but who the other students in the class are, how you position students competently, how you orient students to each other's ideas. And that's only one way in which we're starting to untangle these issues of equity in the work that we're doing, but tied clearly to the mathematical work. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to take on other ways in which we're also attending to these issues of equity and social justice in how we think about working on these core practices.
Good morning. So I think actually there's a good transition between Megan and myself. While Megan spoke about how she leverages core practices inside of a mathematics methods course and across her colleagues who teach in mathematics methods, I'm going to talk about how I've been able to leverage core practices inside of foundations in teacher education. I teach a collection of courses on multicultural education. And one of the things I've found is as my course, before I began leveraging core practices, my course was organized around sort of a series of themes and topics, important themes and topics about identity and culture, about oppression and resistance, and how histories of oppression have actually informed our systems of schooling and the disciplines that we teach. And that list of themes and topics was very important, I think, actually for novice teachers to begin to master, but I had very little evidence when they left my courses about whether or not they were able to take the ideas that they had developed through that course and actually apply them in practice in the work of teaching. And as I began the work with the Core Practice Consortium to begin thinking about how practice can be a bridge in some ways between theories and ideas and the actual work of teaching, I started to rephrase the question that I was asking myself when I organized my own course in foundations. And the question I started to ask was, how might we better prepare novices to enact teaching practices that interrupt inequitable disparities that have arisen out of histories of oppression? And that forced me to think very differently about the work that I do with novice teachers. So what I first began to do was think, all right, I have a list of themes and topics. How might I reorganize that into practices, into things that people habitually do in classrooms? And I started with a set of ideas that commonly organize multicultural education, James Banks's 5 dimensions of multicultural education. Things like content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice reduction, et cetera. And I began to reconceptualize them as practices, as things teachers do. So prejudice reduction for me became anticipating and responding to prejudice in the context of teaching. And I had to begin to think about, if I want to have teachers who anticipate and respond to prejudice in effective ways in classrooms that change students, what do they have to learn how to do? And what do they have to learn how to know in the context of that? So specifying practice got me so far, but as we all know, having a list of specified practices doesn't tell you much about how you help people learn to do those things. And so I adopted actually an idea out of mathematics education, which you saw a little bit of Megan talking about. I adopted the idea of the instructional activity, or a container of practice, an episode of teaching that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that can contain knowledge both about content and about teaching, that can contain principles that ground our perceptions of teaching, that can contain the theory that we want people to learn inside of foundations courses. And so I created instructional activities that were examples of these practices that teachers could learn to enact, and through learning to enact, develop the content knowledge about social justice and about equity that I thought would help them become productive teachers towards social justice in their classrooms. So I want to deep dive into one example of these instructional activities because it might give you a sense of how I'm utilizing them. And the one I'll talk about is the prejudice reduction one. I use this instructional activity to teach teachers how to anticipate and respond to prejudice. It has a purpose for students. It's a norming activity. It's the kind of thing that happens frequently in classrooms. When Pam was talking about practice earlier, she mentioned that we're trying to focus on things that teachers actually do frequently that exist across curricula. Norming for classroom talk is quite a common activity in classrooms. But it also has a purpose for teacher learning. So I try to use this instructional activity to help teachers begin to think about the differences between individual attacks and social group oppression, and to begin to understand the roles that individuals play inside of larger systemic structures of oppression, and how that begins to play out inside classrooms when it comes to social talk in classrooms. So that's the purpose of the instructional activity. And now I'll talk to you a little bit about what it looks like so you can get a vision. the teachers choose artifacts of social talk. So these are examples that come from sort of popular social media. South Park, where the characters are using curse words. This is a picture of Selena Gomez, who's a teen star, and there's a tweet underneath her that says, Selena Gomez is on the radio right now. Is there a volume lower than mute? And then the bottom example is an article from CNN where they're reporting on Paula Deen using the N-word. And teachers have to choose examples that are different types of talk that would be inappropriate for a classroom, but for different reasons, and then engage students in developing an understanding of what's different about these different types of inappropriate language, what makes them inappropriate and why. And then develop with students a representation. So here you'll also see these concentric circles are developed by students who have labeled these different examples as rude, for the South Park example, mean for the Selena Gomez example, and connected to histories of oppression for the Paula Deen example. And one of the things I'm trying to work on with novices as they run this type of activity is not just an understanding of the roles of individuals and the roles of social groups, but also actually how to facilitate discussion, how to engage people around a common artifact, and use talk moves in order to get them to develop deeper understandings of the content under study. So now I've sort of talked with you a little bit about specifying practices, creating examples of those practices inside of an instructional activity, a container that has a beginning, middle, and an end. But that also tells us very little, actually, about how somebody would learn to do it, right? Those are really just specifications. So I'll talk to you a little bit now about how I go about actually helping people learn this thing, and you'll see it's quite similar to what Megan just discussed. So what I'm employing is this, what we call the learning cycle, and it's used in slightly different variations across many of our members of the Core Practice Consortium. I begin by engaging novice teachers in some kind of representation of the activity, whether that's by modeling teaching or showing a video of teaching. Then we move into collaborative planning, where people have to engage in artifacts themselves and choose what are the appropriate artifacts for this activity and how would I use them to help students develop an understanding of what they're trying to learn. They go out and they teach themselves, they videotape themselves, they come back with a videotape of their own teaching, and we analyze that video. And through those different pedagogical moves, I'm engaging them in the learning of the activity and the embedded practice. So Megan showed you an example of a rehearsal. I'm going to show you a short clip of myself modeling this instructional activity. And what I want you to look for as we're watching is the ways in which both the content of social justice and equity, this idea that we're trying to unpack the difference between individual biases and larger social group oppression. So look for that, and also look for what are the talk moves that are being used that might help a novice learn how to develop a better understanding of how to facilitate discussion. You won't see me in this particular clip stepping out and giving people an insight into my own thinking. Just for the sake of time, this is the particular clip that I'm choosing. All right. Also, I played this once and it was very loud at the beginning, so we'll see if that happens this time.
First of all, one group, speak to me. One is disrespectful. Do you guys think yes? Tell me why.
Like, why do you think? Well, they use curse words and that disrespectful, that's not useful.
Using curse words. Who wants to add on to that? Another group. Why might using curse words be considered disrespectful?
It's targeted to an audience.
What? Tell me more.
So, I guess, like the first example, like the celeb chef, it's directed to like a certain population. And the second one, the Selena Gomez example, like it was a personal attack. It was like directed to an individual, but it always has that like target group.
So okay, now we're talking about a whole bunch of those. Selena Gomez, celeb chef, South Park. As she said, they have different targets. She said celeb chef is targeted at a group, is that what you said? And then Selena Gomez is targeted at an individual? What about South Park?
It was indirect.
That's my question too, because it said all the time also. So
yeah.
it's really targeted at a group.
Okay, so I'm going to write these first ideas
a specific group for a certain reason, versus in South Park, it's not targeting a specific group for like a certain reason.
Connected to a, is this what you're saying? Connected to a history of oppression? Wow, I think that Jay just pointed out something really great, and I'm going to highlight it here. The celeb chef word is connected to a history of oppression. The F word that ends with up is not, right? It's just sort of inappropriate. All right, so let's think of some names for this. Connected to a history of oppression, targeted at an individual.
So after watching this type of engaging in this type of a model, we then move into collaborative planning and rehearsal. And in rehearsal, we try to work on the content itself, the social justice content in this example, right? The difference between personal attack and social group oppression, developing that idea themselves. But we also work on a set of other things that are about the facilitation of discussion. We work on eliciting and responding to students. We work on creating representations of student ideas and of the content. That's concentric circles that you saw earlier in a slide are an example of that. Uptake of student ideas in the service of the instructional goal and orienting students to one another. There's a set of things that we work on, both the content itself and the practical moves that teachers have to make in a classroom to utilize student ideas in effective ways. So hopefully that example helps bridge those two things a little bit in a helpful way. We're going to move now into a discussion of how some of us are beginning to think about our own work with core practices in ways that are helping us sort of move into larger communities outside of our own practice and build communities that might be working on similar things and therefore improving at a larger scale. So I'm going to pass it over to Mark and Jessica.
Good morning. I'm Mark Winchell from the University of Washington, and I'm here with my colleague, Jessica Thompson. Jessica and I are science educators and science teacher educators. For the past 6 years, we've been grounding our preparation of secondary science teachers in a set of 4 core instructional practices for middle and high school teachers. We've also conducted longitudinal studies about how our novices take up ambitious forms of teaching, both during their internships and through their first year of teaching. We've also completed comparative studies to see if there are positive and consequential differences in how our graduates perform in contrast with matched groups of first-year teachers from programs that don't use core practices or ambitious teaching as part of their preparation. We'll say more about that in a moment. But our role in this session today is to share 2 next step ideas. These ideas refocus the lens of practice on our own work as teacher educators. These can be phrased as questions. For example, first, what are the core practices of teacher education that we use to prepare professionals? For example, practices like modeling, structuring novices' opportunities to rehearse, video analyses of teaching. And second, could a community be formed that takes these practices as the objects of testing and refinement for the purpose of continually improving teacher education? Could we identify, characterize, and solve problems of practice at this collective level that could not be solved by well-intentioned individuals or institutions? But now, briefly, let's return to our instructional context at the University of Washington. Pictured here are let me get that move forward. There we go. Pictured here are our 4 core instructional practices for middle school and high school science teaching. These range from eliciting students' ideas to helping students construct evidence-based explanations. As I mentioned earlier, we have evidence that attention to such a core of high-leverage practices within a preparation program has resulted in beginners who can perform exceptionally well on multiple measures of teaching quality. They can also create legitimate variations of the practices based on their underlying principles. Novices also create their own tools that are associated with these practices. One thing that is really important to us as well, when we go into classrooms and observe them, in post-teaching observations, our students are able to identify specific issues about where their practice was breaking down. When we took a look at comparison cohorts that were not exposed to core practices and did not have much conversation in their program about practice at all, they might say things like, "My students were not participating today." And a shrug would follow. They're not sure why. Our students, in contrast, might say something like, our students were not participating today. And I think it was because I didn't have any representations of their thinking up on the wall that they could refer to that would support that conversation. But our own practice as teacher educators has shifted dramatically in the last 3 years. Since our involvement in the CORE Consortium, we've developed with our colleagues in that consortium a beginning stage of a shared vision of excellence in teacher preparation. Even at this beginning stage, it's enough for us at the University of Washington to rethink how we engage in activities such as modeling and rehearsals with our novices. To use a bit of organizational theory, in our consortium, we're trying to develop a kind of social capital, initially amongst ourselves, that will allow us as a group to address real problems in preparing ambitious teachers, problems that have existed for years, but that no individual person or institution has been able to solve. For example, what kinds of scaffolding does a novice educator need to learn in order to orchestrate productive forms of classroom discussion? It's a simple question. It's important to teacher educators and to their novices, but what little knowledge of this we have exists only in bits and pieces, and it's certainly not accessible to the community of teacher educators. Creating improvement communities that are sustained by a shared vision of excellence in instruction seems like a strategic move for teacher educators, but as Jessica will share now, there are challenges for developing such communities, especially when they aim to change practice itself.
So this morning you've heard a little bit about how we've been specifying practice both at the K-12 level as well as at thinking about teacher ed pedagogies. And what we're thinking about today is we're trying to think forward. What are our next steps? As we start to specify these practices, how can we not just understand the practices, but how can we take on grand challenges in education? So today what I'm going to share briefly is an example from how we've been developing an improvement community around the K-12 practices, how we've been engaged in partnerships with local school districts where we have our novice teachers placed in the schools that we're working in, and then use some of those ideas of building community to think about what's our work ahead. So the idea that we're borrowing from is actually from some of Tony Breich's work in networked improvement communities. And the idea is that when we can get a variety of role actors together, teachers, students, university personnel, district coaches, principals, district leadership, when we can all come together and when we begin with a set of core practices, how do we get everyone to share a common understanding of those practices, and then use that as a leverage point to work on some problems that we've had trouble gaining traction on. So particularly we think about how can we use these practices to work on historical inequities in classrooms? How can we begin to think about ideas like really leveraging cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our students, and not just nominally think about who our students are, but really put that at the center of our practice. So I'll give you an example of what we've been doing in our K-12 work. As this is actually an example from a middle school classroom, a middle school where we have our teachers and teacher educators placed. And the idea is that we're using some ideas from math education about working on practice in practice. So we work with teachers during the day. We're co-planning, we're co-teaching, we're co-debriefing. In fact, we actually teach the same lesson twice together. And this is with teachers and teacher educators. And what you can see here is the evolution of a tool that we were using. In this case, it was we were studying electrical currents, and this is an electrolysis example. But what you need to know is that after the first lesson that we taught, we came back and debriefed, and the teachers were very disappointed that they didn't get to see what the kids were understanding, because the pages were roughly blank. So we didn't have a lot to go off of. So as we reflected on kids learning, looked at some videotapes, debriefed what we saw in the kids' work, we revised our tool to go into 5th period. But 5th period was actually a class that had high EL and high special ed population. So the teacher said, we need to go in with more scaffolds in place. And so that we built in some boxes and some zoom-ins to help the kids talk about their practice more. When we came back to debrief this, the teachers all noticed that their EL and their special ed students were talking at a deeper scientific explanation than their honors class in the 1st period. This kind of idea is just taking one idea of improvement within a single day, but then we're thinking about how do we spread this knowledge across our whole network? How do we take some of these ideas of embedded knowledge in tools and spread them throughout a network? I think as a community, what we've learned is that the most important part of our networked improvement community is the students, because they're the ones that can really show us what's possible, and having that image out in front of us is really important for how we think about improving our practice. So as we turn to start thinking about the improvement communities and what it is that we can take on as a consortium, there's a few questions, lingering questions. We're working right now on specifying practice, both at the K-12 level and for teacher educators. But now our next question is, I think, what is the grand equity challenge that we want to take on? How can, and at what level? Is it in the K-12 classroom? Is it thinking about taking on equity questions within teacher ed? We have lots of possibilities and lots of opportunities. Another challenge that we'll have to think about is who's in our local improvement networks. We can imagine that it might be teacher educators, but let's also think about cooperating teachers, interns, and what about students? Where do they belong in our work? These are some of the questions that I think we need to continue to ask. And we also need to think about then, as we specify the questions we would like to work on, how do we know that we're improving? What are going to be our measures? Is it at the level of what teacher practice is, or is it at the level of K-12 practice? It's a challenge that we have, being 2 layers out, but also a really rich opportunity in terms of what we can take on and addressing some of the historical inequities in our educational system. So but our work begins with really specifying our practices, both at the K-12 level and in teacher ed. And Deborah Ball is going to talk more about our work around specifying those practices.
I'm Deborah Ball from the University of Michigan, but I'm actually representing Morva McDonald, who is the co-director of the Core Practices Consortium from the University of Washington. So I'll be talking, kind of closing, putting the frame back around what we've been doing together. And I'll put the diagram back up that Pam showed earlier. In the work we're doing together, we're working on 4 things. We're trying to learn to connect, having an articulated, principled vision of the kinds of teachers whom we want to develop and the kind of teaching that we think is crucial for them to learn to do. Thinking about how to connect that with an explicit and articulated curriculum for what to focus on in teacher education, that sprawling curriculum that Pam mentioned earlier, how to focus on practices that will give beginning teachers the most leverage, the most agency in trying to work on the sorts of teaching that we want them to be able to do. We're thinking about what are the ways that we as teacher educators learn to teach those things that we've identified as being crucial, that is teacher education pedagogies, and then thinking about how to connect all of that to how we learn to track on what novices are able to do as they enter teaching. So that's a visual that captures our work. I want to say a little bit about the research agenda. You've heard some of that, and you've heard also about what we're developing, but let me make more visible what our research questions are at this point, given the core assumptions that underlie the consortium's work. The first 2 questions are questions really about the development and practice of teacher education. So we're curious about, in a world of higher education where the currency is usually that each of us invents our own courses, our own ways of doing things, sometimes even in our own institutions, we're not particularly connected to others within the programs, and certainly across institutions, it's rare that there would be common sense of language, of practices, of ways of working, and we're interested in learning from our own experience what are the challenges and to what extent can people across institutional contexts working in different environments with different teacher candidates and different subject matters actually find some common ground around the core practices and pedagogies of teacher education. And along with that, as with that commitment, we're seeking to understand better what are some of the things that arise as these work we've done together is implemented in a variety of settings. So having specified some agreements about language, about core practices, about pedagogies, what does it look like as these are implemented in a variety of settings that vary in their institution and vary the subject matter and the like? And what accounts for the variation? Is some of that necessary? Is some of that part of the work going forward about how we do learn to work in common as a profession? The other two research questions in which we will be heading toward are questions really about the product of that work, not just its processes, but as we move into focusing in these ways on core practices and particular ways of teaching them, we're obviously interested in, within the program, how teacher candidates learn to enact these. As we work on our pedagogy and work on the curriculum, what do we find about novices' learning of core practices of teaching and the integration of that with the whole fabric of teaching and who they are and whom they're teaching? And obviously, in the long term, we're interested in learning about how these hold as they begin to work in new contexts as beginning teachers. So that gives you a sense of the research agenda. The stages of the research really have three parts. The first, where we've been doing a large amount of our work, is the specification of what are these core practices and pedagogies. You've heard some of examples from particular parts of the consortium about the ways in which we've worked to find common ground and then develop those in particular contexts and with particular ways of teaching. I remind you here of the institutions that are part of this context and the subject matters represented. A second, where we'll be heading already this fall, is using things we've developed together in common, some common ground about particular practices and ways of working in the specific environments of our institutions and programs. So that's stage 2. And stage 3, where we'll be moving, is what I've just mentioned about learning to track on what happens for novices as they engage in this sort of teacher education work. What do they learn, and what are we learning about our own efforts to pull that off? In our current effort right now, subject area teams, the elementary math group, the science group, and the like, are working on either specifying in common core practices of leading a discussion or as well as modeling or representing core content. So everyone is working on discussion in some way, and then some of us are working more on representing core content, some of us more on modeling, which are related in terms of making content available for students to engage in. A second thing that we're working to find common ground in particular so that we can try these things out in our own environments is ways of teaching these core practices within a particular subject matter using pedagogies, and here I'm using the word modeling in a second way, using pedagogies of modeling in teacher education or rehearsals. So we'll be learning to work on particular pedagogies across our institutional contexts in common. And we're working on figuring out the plans for how to implement these units that we're developing across our sites. I'd like to close by trying to perhaps leave you with some clarity about, I hope, about what we are trying to do and what we're not trying to do. So in the department of what we are trying to do, we are trying to do something that we think teacher educators have long worked to try to do and often found difficult, and that is to try to connect, as they are in actual work of teaching, in practice, connect things we've typically compartmentalized into methods, foundations, theory, practice. I think you heard several examples in the work of Megan's work and Sarah's work, and also in Mark and Jessica's work, of efforts to break down what have been walls that actually don't mirror very well what the practice of teaching involves. And we're trying hard to reconnect those in teacher education. We're also obviously exploring what it looks like to try to reach greater professional consensus about the nature of what teachers might be learning and how we might work with them. We're in that context trying to understand what might constitute principled variations across sites. In what ways, although we've agreed to find common ground, what are some of the necessary variations and what are they related to? We are pushing quite hard in the direction of trying to be as explicit and specified as possible about what we're working on, but we also are clear-eyed enough to want to understand what the limits of that are and how to understand how far can one push to really try to specify what we're working on and where is it important to hold back from that. And we think that we stand to learn a great deal from our own work as well as from others with whom we'll be connecting. It's also reasonable for us to try to say to you that there's some things we're really not trying to do. We're not, for example, trying to arrive at the correct list of what the core practices are. Even among us, there are differences in what we're currently putting in the foreground in our own work, in our own programs. What's important to us is the notion of there being something like a core practice and what its definition is and why it's important and what is the grain size or way of describing it. We're also not similarly trying to arrive at the correct or final examples of what teacher education pedagogy would include, but we are trying to open up a discourse around what are specified ways of trying to teach practice to novices, to name those and to develop them. The concept of there being such a thing as a teacher education pedagogy, which has emerged in the field in the last years, how to push that forward so that we have common ground about our own practice as teacher educators. And finally, we're not trying to prescribe what the perfect teacher education program. I think these are all of a cloth. We're not trying to narrow everything down to the point that there's no variability. I think I've said this now in several different ways, but we are trying to find what would constitute much more in the company of something being like professional preparation for a profession, which would mean it wouldn't vary by matters of style or preference, but be more in the spirit of how do we negotiate where we're heading the kinds of teachers that American schools need and how we can best help to develop those across contexts. If you're interested in entering to the conversation with us, here's an email to which you could write, and we'll, through this, be able to start developing a broader sense of a community of people who may want in their own ways to become involved with this work or keep track of it. And we invite you to write to us here so that we can know who you are and find ways to begin to connect with you. And I think with that, I'm going to not show that picture, but maybe show this one. I don't know. Let's see, Pam, how do I get back there? Here. Back to the title of this symposium and invite our discussant to join us. We're really honored to have Tony Breik from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching to be our discussant. I think you could, those of you who know Tony's work over time about improvement, about community work on improvement, about collective work to look at how one builds these things iteratively by looking at evidence and setting goals, I think you can see why he's the perfect discussant for us, and we're looking forward very much to how he may push all of us in thinking about where this can go in the development of teacher education practice and its improvement. So, Tony?
Thank you, Deborah, and I think it's still morning, so good morning. This is interesting, innovative, challenging, courageous work in an effort to transform how a field thinks about doing its work very differently. And before I go into my comments and the challenges that I think some of the challenges I think this work raises, I'd like to just begin by suggesting we offer the panel a round of applause. It's really good work. This is good work, and it's very hard work. Just a bit of background. For almost 20 years, I worked on the problem of trying to strengthen teaching and learning in the context of primary literacy, working on what I would call this causal cascade from the intentional design of professional development to questions about teacher learning, to transformation of practices in classrooms, to how this culminates in student learning, and how do you get a system like this to actually achieve quality reliably at scale, where the aim is really ambitious teaching supporting deeper learning. The first thing I think I came to realize about this is that when we think about these core practices, the nature of the task complexity, thinking about this as an organizational sociologist, the nature of the task complexity that we're actually asking teachers to engage in, and how over this last period of years we have greatly increased the task complexity of teaching. When I was in school,
we did something called round-robin reading. And remember, probably many of you experienced this, and it's a teaching task. This is a pretty simple task because everybody's reading a few sentences, kind of goes around the room, somebody makes a mistake, you correct them, and that's sort of the role of teaching. Contrast this with now what might be considered, which is now a fairly common practice of guided reading, where you have students working in reading groups. Teacher has to choose the appropriate text given the strategy, the particular strategic objective for that reading group, also taking into account what interests, background, cultural knowledge students may have. There's the issue of how you introduce this text, what you actually have to get out ahead of time so that students can actually engage the text when they go into reading. Teacher typically is taking a running record while this activity is going on, and the question is, how do you interpret that running record for what you're actually going to do? And then there's the after reading activity where there's often a direct mini lesson that tries to bring out the key reading strategy that was the focus of that lesson, and also then orchestrate a comprehension conversation about the meaning of the text. That is a very complex task, and we expect teachers to do this several times a day and do it with some quality day in and day out. How do we get people good at doing this kind of work? And one of the things that this leads you to is really the question that you have to be able to sort of answer on the ground. What does quality in execution of a task like this actually look like? And how do you make it more likely to happen more reliably? Now, this leads to sort of one observation, which is the problem of cognitive load in teaching. We know a lot about this across a lot of different work contexts, that as the work task becomes more complex, errors are more likely to occur. Steps are forgotten, practice can break down. We have a finite amount of things that any of us can attend to at any given moment in time. What that means then is the tasks become more complex. It puts much more weight on the tools, the routines, the microscripts, the things that you can command with automaticity so you don't have to think about those, so that your cognitive attention can focus on what is specific to what's happening in front of you. So to do complex tasks well requires actually the specification of these kinds of tools, routines, microscripts, or what we've come to call standard work. The more complex the task, the more you need that kind of scaffolding to be able to implement those tasks with quality on some sort of regularity. So thinking about what that layer looks like is incredibly important in this kind of work. This is where I think the issue of common language comes in as a very important framework in terms of what specifically are we trying to accomplish together. And one of the problems of the field of teacher education, my view, looking back historically, is that it has actually been structured as a kind of cottage industry. We have a lot of people working very hard trying to accomplish complex tasks, how to strengthen the preparation, how to strengthen teacher education programs. But it is, by analogy, I think of it as similar to the Tower of Babel story in Genesis. You have a lot of people working very hard, but without common language, common frameworks, and in the case of this work, I would also add common measures, we can't build this complex structure together. It simply can't happen without trying to do what this group is actually now attempting to do, to work in network on solving a common problem. Second implication coming out of this. If you think about these as complex tasks to be enacted in classrooms, then it seems natural to think about this as a problem of expertise development. And we know a lot about expertise development, again, when we look into other contexts. One of the natural things you have to ask as soon as you think about this as a problem of expertise development is, well, what is the arc of development? What would you expect a novice to do with one of these core practices? And what does more expert enactment look like? And what are the transitions that one is likely to go through as we move individuals from novices to more expert in their enactment? So that in developing the core practices, this becomes another one of the kind of critical questions to ask. Third observation. Coming out of our work on bringing the discipline of improvement research into education carried out through networks, one of the core principles in improvement research is you cannot improve at scale what you cannot measure. So can we agree on what quality enactment of any one of these core practices actually looks like in classrooms? And it turns out, as I've gone through this experience now several times, that the task of getting a group to actually build a set of rubrics or build a measurement process, more generally, is actually very formative in pushing back on the practices that this thing is supposed to help us measure, whether it's what quality teaching in the classroom of one of these core practices look like. The same sort of question can be raised about what does quality look like and what a teacher-educator does to support people to learn to do this. That the task of measurement forces specificity, and it starts to open up places where, geez, we really didn't think about this. We can start to see some breakdowns in what we're actually doing. That if we don't have data coming back to us about what's actually happening in classrooms, we can live for a very long time with our theories with nothing really pushing back as to evidence that, you know, we just can't make this actually work reliably at scale. So how do we transform this into something that will? Final big question I would put out is in thinking about reforming teacher education, is work around a small number of high leverage practices going to be enough? And again, by this, I mean it's what I always go back to as the ultimate standpoint. Will it assure that we can have quality teaching producing measurable improvements in student outcomes, deeper learning, occurring reliably at scale? What is it going to take to get to that set of practices occurring and outcomes occurring reliably at scale? And so I wonder about, in this, the question of this is the specificity with which you have to engage these core practices. And I understand that the idea of working on high leverage, I would call high leverage core practices, yes, we all have different language on this, how this fits well in the context of higher education. We don't know where our students are going to go. We typically don't know what set of instructional resources they may have to work with. Maybe the Common Core will help with this, but that's very much an open question. And so we sort of back up to a level of generality, something we can work on that we believe our teacher education students will actually be able to use, all of which is very sensible. But it's still then removed from the actual day-to-day work they do. That is, we teach something to somebody using some set of instructional resources, and quality enactment has to occur there. One of the, this is actually a little aside, but one of the things I also worry about in this work is that while in the context of the teacher education classroom, you can slow the process down and have extended conversations about the teaching, one of the hardest things for new teachers is the speed at which activity comes at you, to which you have to respond. So it's not only learning about the core practice, but how do you actually get to do it in the speed at which you have to do it? And that in turn goes to this question of specificity. How much can we scaffold around this work? And especially, part of one of the connections I make here is the kind of activity that occurs in lesson study, particularly as it was, I see Catherine Lewis over here, as it was originally formulated in Japan, not so much as the way the practice has necessarily been enacted across the United States, but where the specific lesson and how to engage, what a pedagogy looks like to engage students deeply in learning some particular content, understanding what the common misunderstandings are likely to arise in this, how you might respond to those, and building up essentially a deep set of micro-level practices around the teaching of a lesson. Right now, we expect every teacher to invent this typically on his or her own. And again, looking at it from a quality improvement perspective, whenever you see a process where basically you're assuming everybody's going to invent it on their own, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get wide variability in performance. So the question of how deep you have to go, how much specificity actually has to be in an initiative like this, if in the end you're going to judge the work by are we much more likely to see ambitious teaching occurring that's producing deeper learning in all of our classrooms. I mean, one of the things I would contrast this to is that a number of settings where the task that this group is taking on, I think I've seen occur, but they're also, the problem context is simpler. Example, the ambitious kind of teaching that was occurring in District 2 in New York back 2 decades ago around primary literacy. It was ambitious teaching, it was focusing on deeper learning, but they had the advantage that they were working within a very specific instructional system. You were going to get good at doing these 6 practices. And we had a lot of detail about what each of those practices were, and one could then support these with a whole set of tools, routines, microscripts, if you will. You see, I think, the same sort of thing when you look at preparation for teaching in a Montessori classroom, which is organizationally a very complex set of practices, but because there's a standard set of practices, you can develop initiatives to prepare people to teach well in that system. I see similar things occurring where some charter management organizations, like High Tech High, are beginning to develop their own teacher preparation initiatives, and they are very structured around how people learn to teach well inside this instructional system. So I think this, again, leaves us with the big question. If our goal is really to improve teacher preparation, to get more ambitious teaching occurring, to get deeper learning, how much of this, how far into the specificity of the practices do we actually have to move if we're going to solve this problem of the extraordinary wide variability in what gets enacted in classrooms, which produces extraordinary wide variability in how much students actually learn. Thank you.
Okay, we kept on time, which I think is a miracle on day 2 of AERA. So we have time for questions from all of you. So let's have some questions. Yes?
You need to use the mic.
Oh, I think there are mics set up. So if you can use the mic, that would be great since this is being taped. There's one over there and one over here.
Hello, my name is Iwan Charyo. I'm a teacher educator from Indonesia, currently a doctoral student at Michigan State University. I'm very fascinated by the work about the core practices, and I think this is the way to go in the future for the teaching field and to professionalize the profession. I have a couple of questions. Number one is, what does it mean, like if, let's say we have come to the agreement about, these are the core practices. Let's say a teacher education institution decides, all right, let's do this. What does it mean to prepare the teacher educators themselves, right? And then talks about the pedagogy of teacher education. And number two, what does it mean? I think this has been talked a little bit, but what does it mean for professional development? Like because the in-service teachers are the ones who are going to be the mentor teachers, the cooperating teachers, the one for the induction program, and the peers of the teachers who are preparing to be engaged in these core practices in our teacher preparation program. And number three, online education, teacher education. So our core practices can be implemented in an online-based teacher professional development or teacher preparation program, and maybe you have thoughts about that too. Thank you very much.
I'll say something about the preparation of teacher educators and professional development, and then somebody maybe could pick up the online. I think actually, I am learning so much. This is actually really in a long career around teacher education, the most generative experience I've had in learning from colleagues, in developing my own practice. And I think the implications for teacher educator learning are huge. Learning to run a rehearsal in the ways that Megan and Elham and Magdalene Lambert have begun to specify is complex work. I do lots of approximation and models and in my teaching, but I'm not used to interrupting students as they're engaged in that teaching to stop and give them feedback in that moment. So I think there's huge implications for teacher-educator learning in this work. And I think one of the things that we're doing through the research, we think of the research, which is funded by the Gates Foundation, as research and development work, because part of what we're trying to do is to develop tools. We're developing videos, we're developing materials to use in the preparation and professional development for teacher educators. Because I think, again, as we specify this work, there's also the problem of how do we help others enact it.
Because you asked the question partly about, or organizationally, about programs, I thought I'll just say something brief from my perspective of being a dean of a school of education. And two things that I think pick up what my colleagues here have been talking about, and something that Tony said that have been instructive to me in watching an entire faculty rework the teacher education program and design at Michigan over the last 8 to 9 years. And one has to do with co-planning, which we, I think, know a lot about from teachers' work, but the fact that teacher educators, which includes instructors and graduate students at Michigan, worked on the specific courses together, making the plans at great levels of detail, and then teaching them and watching one another was incredible professional learning. And the agreement that everyone wasn't going to make his or her own syllabus was part of that, part of the sort of bar that we went over, and I think many people could describe for you what they learned from working with people who are at different stages of their careers on common work around the foundations or methods or the blending of those or the work in the clinical experiences. And the second that's related to something Tony said is that the work on the formative assessments that punctuate the program, sitting together to look at interns' work and to determine what we thought was, how to evaluate and provide feedback on that work was like teachers in schools have also learned that when one looks looks at assessments together with other people teaching those same students. One learns a great deal, both pushing back on our own work, but also learning more, what do we mean when we say we want to see if they've developed routines for setting up small group work, or what did we actually mean when we said we wanted to see their ability to lead a class discussion. So the work on assessments jointly, collectively, has been a very important professional development. So those structures have helped at the programmatic level in bringing people who really have very different kinds of expertise to learn to do this work, usually always doing something slightly harder than we know how to do, but learning from one another. Oh. What is the next question?
Tom Levine, teacher educator at the University of Connecticut. I am so grateful for the difficult and important work you are doing collaboratively. I'd be grateful for your advice about choosing or identifying core practices. You obviously are developing some common language, and you're allowing some variation even across your own settings as to how you conceive these, how you work them up. Do you have any advice for those of us in the field who are interested at the program level at doing this kind of work of identifying them? And then also, do you have any advice about how you either revisit that or continue to confirm or develop that list of core practices that you're aiming for? Thank you.
Well, I can start, and then perhaps others on the panel would like to say something. My own view, and I don't know that we'll all agree, is that if we're going to make progress as a field, we shouldn't be making them up from scratch over and over, but there's as much in common across what we're doing as there is different, and I think as we begin to make those more public, I think we will find that there's probably a rather large percentage that we will agree on as a field, and some of the difficulties that I've seen as people try to do them are not about the disagreements about, oh, is a class discussion an important set of practices, but rather getting clear about what's a practice and what's a principle. So people nominate things and they say, you know, where is something like gradually releasing responsibility, or where is, and they name things that are actually more principles of practice. How do you decide when to be explicit? That's not exactly a practice, it's a principle. And the other thing that has been difficult is not about which things to pick, but what's an appropriate grain size. So is planning an appropriate grain size, or is it something like challenge the textbook? You know, those are the things that have been difficult because we don't have as long a history at finding something that's not too small and not too big. But also what's a practice and what's something that's more like part of the commitments or orientations or principles of the work. I don't know if others want to add.
Well, so the only thing that I want to add to that is that to highlight something that Deborah just said, which is, so we at UCLA are probably farther behind than some of the other institutions in picking up this work as a programmatic set of work. And I think one of the things the mistakes that we made, and is the same mistake I made when I first started doing this work, which is trying to figure out how to do it all by myself. I tried and it didn't work very well, and it wasn't until I joined the Carnegie Group that I had a group of people to work with to help me think together about what might be grain sizes that might work in the work I was trying to do in mathematics education. I think I made the same mistake again when I engaged my colleagues across elementary methods in thinking about what might be the core practices that we would take up. And I think what I would do differently now is not try and invent them, but to draw from this group's work as well as other people in the field's work that have written about the kinds of core practices and start with some. And you might tweak them a little because of your program. You might say, this one's not a good one for us to start with because of how our program works, but you have a grounding in something that's developed that you can then have conversations around.
In addition to the work that we've been doing on these core practices, Matt Closer has developed a set of practices from a Delphi study around the teaching of science. Brad Fogo has developed a set around the teaching of history. So I think there are a lot of starting points right now in terms of identifying, and then I think, as Megan said, bringing people together to really begin to develop that shared understanding of what those mean. We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Ann Edwards from the Carnegie Foundation. Hi, Tony. I actually had two questions, but I'm only going to ask you to respond to one of them now. I will follow up with some of you about the first later. My first question that I do not wish you to respond to now has to do with the implications of this work of the Core Practices Consortium for the pedagogies of professional development and in-service context. I would imagine that due to the change in context and the change in roles that we have to think somewhat differently about the enactment of in the design and enactment of the enactment of your principles in the design enactment of the experiences for in-service teachers. So I will bug you about that later. The second question I had for the panel now has to do with Tony's point about common measurement framework. So I'm curious to what extent you all have thought about or begun working on a common set of measures or a common measurement framework, either within, across the consortium or within subsets of the consortium.
Anybody want to take that up?
We can take that. So at least we've spent the last 8 years studying science teaching practice, and we've been able to, because we've specified the practice, gone in and see what the principal variations look like. And so around our 4 core practices, we've been able to specify at least 5 different ranges of performances, and we look both in classroom conversations. We look at what's the interaction between the teacher and the students, what's the nature of the dialogue in the classroom. So we've been able to specify that, and that's how we track improvement in the actual teaching practices. But it does take getting into classrooms and seeing how it changes, and then how it changes with so we are working both in a PD context and in a teacher ed context. So we have trying this whole systems approach, and then we keep having to redefine our upper anchors because we're seeing new kinds of practices that help us redefine what's possible.
Hi, my name's Andy Danilchik. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. And I think it's exciting about the possibilities of what core practices or high leverage practices can bring. I worry about the unintended consequences, and when things get implemented beyond your small group more broadly, sometimes progressive things tend to get kind of screwed up when they get out there. So when you identified the things that you're not, I could totally see K-12 education enact those things in that way. So what can you do? What are the possible unintended consequences as core practices becomes more broadly accepted in K-12 education? And I think when you focus on something, you potentially could de-emphasize other things. And I'm wondering about some of the things like the development of inquiry stance, child study, being able to focus on kids. You know, if you focus on practices, one possible thing that could happen is teachers can stop focusing on kids so much and try to get their practices right. How do you help teachers, while doing core practice, also develop their conceptual framework for practice, become teacher researchers, inquiry stance, things like that?
Go ahead, Deborah.
2 things. One, we only showed you a couple, so some of the practices across our programs are ones that are specifically about learning to listen to students, learning to build relationships. So we only featured a couple here. And the second is that we are, I think it's worth reminding ourselves, and this is difficult, talking about novice teachers. So it is the case, we think, that some things will have to give, and that deciding which things are important for the entry to teaching and how those build to more complex practices over time is something that the field might need to discuss. So, and the third is that, I guess I said 2 things, but the third is that some of the things you named seem to be more orientations that would get folded in and wrapped around particular practices. So an orientation to inquiry, which maybe Mark will speak to, would be wrapped into particular actual ways you do those things with students. But maybe you want to just speak, Mark?
Yes, I was going to say one way that this could go sideways relates to the comment by the gentleman from Connecticut, the faculty of whom I just spoke to a couple of weeks ago about this. One big mistake I think we could make as teacher educators is not involving our foundations faculty in the development of core practices, because this can easily get read as something that methods instructors do, their domain, and everybody else is marginalized in a teacher ed program, including some of the players out in the field that Jessica had, these key actors like cooperating teachers and field supervisors. From the standpoint of what does a practice include, when I showed the graphic of our 4 core practices, I want to be clear that within the context of each one of those 4 practices, there are many more things that are drawn in than simply the mechanical reproduction of what gets said and done by the teacher. There are issues of equity, of who gets to participate in those practices. Assessment gets built in, woven in with each of those 4 core practices. So they're not just what the teacher says and does in terms of activity. There are a lot of other kinds of issues around preparing teachers that are woven into these practices, and you need to attend to that.
That's a really good question.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I see all these questions still waiting to be answered. We'll stay up here for a little bit to respond to you individually. I want to remind you that there is the email that you can also connect with us on this. I hope that what we've communicated is the spirit of learning and conversation with which we're engaging in this work. And so we very much invite you to join this conversation about what it would mean to improve teacher education and the quality of teaching and learning for students through this kind of improvement effort. So thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to continuing to talk with you.